Putin was appointed prime minister on the same day the Second Chechen War broke out. Amid a more successful military campaign against them and a surprising return to economic growth, Putin quickly became the most popular politician in Russia. As such, in a dramatic scene, Yeltsin resigned from the presidency on December 31st, 1999, placing Putin as acting president and paving the way for a landslide victory in the election just 3 months later. Documented in his Millennium Manifesto, Putin decried the fact that Russia had become the poorest nation in Europe, in which a decade of strong growth would be needed to place it on par with Portugal and Spain, hardly rich nations among Europe as is. He proposed a comprehensive agenda that included an aggressive campaign against crime, a more assertive central government to tackle Russia's disorderly regions and big businesses, and a drive for more investment and global integration. He, like many Russian leaders before him, also pointed to the state's still over-reliance on energy exports as a call to diversify the economy. Indeed, the sudden growth that coincided with Putin taking office was the result of a massive spike in oil prices caused by China's monstrous economic growth and insatiable demand for commodities. With political popularity, big business having been crippled from the Asian financial crisis, and a significant rise in oil revenues, Putin utilized his window of opportunity to unleash his plans to rebuild a strong central government, provoking fear among reformists that he would roll back many of the economic freedoms obtained in the previous decade. He started by re-establishing central control by redrawing Russia's regions and placing loyalists in charge, while at the same time, a new bankruptcy law was used to take on Russia's two most powerful businessmen, ultimately stripping them of their assets, including the two most important independent media groups. Putin then held a lavish barbecue outside Moscow with the rest of the powerful business owners, implicitly threatening that if they stayed out of politics and paid their taxes, they would be allowed to keep ownership of their companies. At the same time, the government reasserted ownership of Gazprom, the gas industry behemoth that descended directly from the Soviet Ministry of Gas. Altogether, Putin sent a powerful message about the rebalancing of power between the state and private business. Along with this, a new 13% flat tax was instituted, and with booming oil production and prices, coupled with big businesses now paying taxes, Russia saw its first year of budget surplus. Some of the surplus was used to reform antiquated public utilities, while archaic land laws were modernized. Meanwhile, the expansion of central power and a major offensive against crime restored a sense of stability for the Russian people and investors. Along with this, larger subsidies and support were given to large industries, which slowly decreased unemployment. Yet a key characteristic of Putin's economic strategy was an adherence to prudent monetary and fiscal policy. From the late 1990s to 2007, foreign debts shrank from $131 billion to just $40 billion. That was just 3% of GDP, the healthiest among the top 20 largest economies in the world. Meanwhile, a new stabilization fund, along with the central bank, soaked up excess oil revenues, eventually amassing into an impressive war chest of cash to use in times of crisis. With all of these factors combined, the Russian economy started booming, growing by on average 7.2% a year during Putin's first 7 years in power, although a majority of that growth funneled to just a tiny minority of business owners. And while most big business owners played by Putin's rules, there was one exception: Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who had acquired Yukos, a large oil company, when Yeltsin sold it off for political support. He then turned Yukos from an inefficient company into a wildly profitable enterprise, in the process becoming the richest man in Russia. He did not heed Putin's threats and continued to talk openly of his political aspirations, paid off parliament members to favor laws that benefited Yukos, exposed corruption among Putin's government, and was actively in talks to sell off Russia's largest oil fields to the American-based ExxonMobil. In a stunning move, Putin ordered authorities to arrest Khodorkovsky for tax fraud, in which he was found guilty, stripped of his businesses, and sent to prison for 10 years. Yukos was then merged with the state-owned Rosneft, which quickly became Russia's largest oil company. This high-profile case, which attracted international attention, masked a much larger effort by the government to retake controls of sectors it deemed as strategically important, including military and nuclear power manufacturing and vast portions of the profitable natural resource extraction sector. Meanwhile, thousands of small to medium-sized enterprises began to be ransacked by the government itself or by corrupt state officials for personal gain. Soon, either by representation on company boards, direct ownership, or by implicit threat, the government came to dominate a huge number of industries, eventually becoming the single most important entity in the economy, representing 70% of economic activity by 2015. Putin's carefully crafted political economic system started to look much more like Soviet central control than a modern market-based democratic system, and can be simplified into three sectors. Sector A includes industries that are internationally competitive and bring in a vast majority of money, equaling some 85% of export revenues. This sector is entirely dominated by the government, and includes oil, gas, mining, and large agricultural companies, as well as military and nuclear manufacturing. Sector B is represented by non-competitive industries that rely on government subsidies, credit, and/or laws to prevent competition. They are geared towards selling to the domestic population and include the car industry, shipbuilding, and social groups reliant on the government for income, namely civil servants and pensioners. This sector, which supports a vast majority of Russians, is therefore directly reliant on the government redistributing revenues from Sector A. This means the survivability of these companies are not reliant upon innovating nor improving efficiency, but improving their importance to the government, whether that be providing consumer goods or employing lots of people. In essence, the government uses revenues, mainly from oil and gas, to keep people working, and in doing so, gains political support from the general population and business owners. Sector C operates without government intervention and includes retail, construction, and many small businesses the government does not deem strategically important. This sector does not generate much tax revenue, but also does not need government support to survive. Being left to their own, this is a sector that can spur on productivity gains and innovation. Yet continually weak property rights stifles investment and/or discourages altogether new businesses from emerging. After all, why invest in a new venture or expand your company if it can be seized by corrupt state officials? As a result, this sector remains small and largely insignificant. This entire system was carefully crafted to cement political power for Putin and other elites, while also catering to a wide range of competing interests. Control of Sector A gives the government direct access to the major sources of revenue, while keeping the most powerful businessmen in alignment with the state. An inefficient Sector B that relies upon the government gives millions of people employment and in doing so, generates political support for Putin. Meanwhile, the strong and more centralized state is able to crack down on crime and intervene in times of crisis with its massive war chest of cash. As far as the average citizen is concerned, this system has worked, as quality of life has substantially improved since the bleak 1990s. Life expectancy is now much higher, inflation has stayed modest, while unemployment and crime have stayed relatively low. Even though the economy has grown wildly unequal, life was simply better than it was prior. Yet fundamentally, Putin's economy carries on the legacies of the Soviet Union's flaws. Productivity and innovation remains painfully stagnant, and as such, wages perpetually lag behind workers' European counterparts. Just like the Soviet Union, many industries rely on technical imports and financing from the West, including advanced machinery, oil extraction methods, and complex components like microchips. Meanwhile, the economy itself is almost entirely dependent on the price of oil. When oil prices are high, the economy booms, and profits from Sector A trickle to the rest of the economy. When prices are low, the economy enters severe recessions. While growth slowed after 2008, the economy was still largely stable. This all started to change in 2014, when Russian foreign policy took a sharp turn. As Ukraine's pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych was ousted in 2014, heavily armed separatists along with Russian troops took control of Crimea, which was soon after illegally annexed by Russia. At the same time, Russia started supplying separatists and carrying out military operations in the Donbas region. As this was a gross violation of international law, Europe and the United States slapped Russia with economic sanctions, ranging from freezing Russian elites' assets, banning the sale of key technical components and weapons, prohibiting Western involvement in new energy projects, and most critically, restricting loans to strategic sectors of the Russian economy. Along with falling oil prices, the Russian economy entered a severe recession. Russian politics quickly became embroiled in trying to find a way to sanction-proof the economy in a so-called Fortress Russia policy. To attempt this, Russian industries started producing banned components or finding other sources from Asia. An alternative to national payments was rolled out, while a huge drive to expand and modernize the military saw expenditure rise from 3.8% to 5.5% of GDP, far outpacing the spending rates seen in Europe and even the US. The government and private companies started to further shed external debts, while the central bank sold off its reserves of US dollars in favor of Chinese and European currencies. At the same time, a greater emphasis was placed on increasing Russia's financial war chest, which was aided by energy prices recovering and the government cutting social spending. By 2021, Russia had over $600 billion worth of reserves to use in case of emergency. All of these efforts to build a fortress Russian economy and Putin's 22 years of cementing political and economic power would be put to the test when, in early 2022, he launched his so-called special military operation in Ukraine. On February 24, 2022, Russian troops and tanks rolled across the Ukrainian border, while missiles fired indiscriminately, raining down on strategic targets in civilian cities alike. It didn't take long for the West to strike back with the harshest and most comprehensive sanctions in almost a century, amounting to a full-on economic war. Targeted measures crippled the trade of badly needed materials and complex components. Meanwhile, Russia's central bank had more than 60% of its reserves frozen by Western institutions. And eventually, Russia was cut off from SWIFT, the international bank messaging system, which in a globalized world was seen as a kill shot straight to the heart of the Russian economy. The general consensus being blasted from experts, economists, and the media foretold of Russia's impending economic collapse. Forecasts ranged from a complete collapse of Russia's financial system to a catastrophic shrinking of 15% of its GDP by year's end. Western sanctions in theory were designed to cripple Russia as follows. The sharp negative external shocks to trade and the financial sector would see a huge outflow of money from Russia immediately, causing the ruble to collapse and inflation to spike. In a panic and to preserve savings, a critical mass of Russians would then try to pull money out of their bank accounts, causing a banking crisis. An ensuing decrease in credit, demand, and access to critical imports would force industries to shut down, leading to further inflation and unemployment. State revenues would dwindle, forcing a contraction of spending, leading to a further decline in economic activity. The result would be a breakdown in Russia's economy, rendering Putin incapable of financing a war while contending with mass social unrest, which in turn would hopefully lead to a retreat from Ukraine. Initially, signs pointed to this being a potential reality. $250 billion worth of capital, which is equal in value to 14% of Russia's GDP, poured out of the country, while the ruble collapsed by over 50%. Airline prices more than doubled as hundreds of thousands of wealthy and educated workers fled the nation, while everybody else tried to take money out of their banks and protests erupted. Meanwhile, almost all international corporations pulled out of the country, including McDonald's, whose opening 32 years ago in Moscow symbolized just how much the Soviet Union was changing. Its departure from Russia in 2022 marked a new era of rapid change to the Russian economy. Yet a year on, Russia is still engaging in a fierce and protracted war. While sanctions have historically never been capable of stopping conflict, Russia's economy appeared to have surpassed every single gloomy prediction. By the end of 2022, GDP barely shrank, inflation increased, but by much less than expected, and unemployment reached all-time lows, while the state has become stuffed with cash. All of this is a byproduct of quick action by the Russian state and years of preparation. To stop initial panic in the financial sector, interest rates were massively raised to send a message that they were serious about tackling inflation, which not only curtailed a run on banks, but even encouraged Russians who had taken money out of their banks during the pandemic to deposit it back in. Meanwhile, the state introduced further aid and subsidies to companies and banks to keep investment levels up. As the ruble collapsed, the government banned foreign currency from being exported and forced 80% of any profits made by companies selling overseas to buy back rubles. In combination with a sharp drop in imports, the ruble bounced back to hit 8-year highs. In essence, the government, through various control mechanisms, had artificially raised the value of the ruble by increasing demand and reducing supply. Even as over half of Russia's war chest was frozen by Western institutions, it still had $300 billion left to work with to intervene in the economy. And coupled with Russia's very low foreign debts, banks and companies were not as reliant on Western financing as they had been prior. These proactive measures and preparations were able to blunt the mechanisms behind a financial crisis from occurring, while restoring some semblance of stability and confidence to the Russian people. Yet most critically to all of this, Putin had correctly calculated that despite Russia's over-reliance on energy exports, Europe had become equally reliant upon Russian energy imports. In 2021, Europe imported a titanic 155 billion cubic meters of natural gas, 108 billion tons of crude oil, 91 million tons of petroleum products, and 51.4 million tons of coal from Russia. While nations pledged to reduce their imports from Russia, the logistical and financial strains behind quickly finding alternative sources proved easier said than done. And yet, at the very same time, the geopolitical and economic uncertainty that such a large war caused, in combination with a surge in demand from economies reopening after the pandemic, saw oil and gas prices hit 11-year highs. While the total volume of energy exports from Russia did decline in 2022, Russia saw its largest gush of oil and gas revenues in its history, at $230 billion, or 34% more than the year prior. Total commodity export revenues reached $580 billion, or 40% more than its 10-year average. And when combined with a drop in imports, Russia recorded a trade surplus between January and September of $198 billion, or more than double the previous record in 2008. Gazprom alone paid 5 trillion rubles in taxes, or more than half the total government spending on the war and security thus far. Instead of having to cut back on spending, the government has dramatically increased subsidies to Sector B and ramped up military spending. In effect, Russia has used the proceeds of its oil and gas sales to Europe to continue its brutal campaign in Ukraine. While most European countries have by now shifted large portions of their energy imports away from Russia, trade with non-Western countries has boomed, particularly with India, Turkey, and China, who are more than happy to not only soak up discounted energy imports, but also provide Russia with now banned Western components, technology, and industrial inputs. At the same time, Central Asian countries such as Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and Georgia have been used as bypasses to sanctions, as European goods are bought by middlemen in the country who then resell to Russia, which has kept many factories running as usual. Meanwhile, gigantic so-called shadow fleets of oil tankers are using non-Western ships, logistics, and financing to keep Russian exports flowing. The war has also brought a boom to the military-industrial complex, with some factories running 24 hours a day, while other new industries have emerged to replace previously imported goods and services. So with only a small hit to GDP, record profits, a nearly full war chest of cash, and eager new trading partners and supply lines, does this mean Putin has really constructed an economy impervious to sanctions, one that will be capable of funding the war indefinitely, and one that will continue to prop up Russia as a major power for the foreseeable future? The answer in the long run is almost certainly no.